Hello and welcome to God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm educator and court magician Giles Goff.
And I'm librarian and coven leader Julia Hall. And today we're going to be switching up the format a little bit. So I am going to be telling you what film we're looking at today, and that is going to be the 90s cult classic that inspired a whole new generation of witches, The Craft. And this time I'm going to be asking Giles, what did you think of this film?
Basically, in one of the episodes that we did previously, Julia started going off on stuff about like Wicca and how it's different from witchcraft and paganism, and I was like, this is great. It's not even close to where we're meant to be about. So I just said to
it's true. I
said to Julia, do you want to do an episode purely just about Wicca and we'll flip it up? So she was a 100% down for it. I've seen her notes, guys. She's 100% down for this. And frankly, I get to do the easy stuff and just chill out. So I've been really looking forward to this one, you know?
You deserve a nice little rest, Giles. You've worked so hard over the past however many years. You deserve a nice little break.
Thank you very much. That's really nice. Okay, should we get to the Giles facts?
Yeah, hell yeah. I'm excited. This is a weird position to be in now. Tell me some facts, Giles.
Isn't it just? So, The Craft is a 1996 teen supernatural horror film directed by Andrew Fleming from a screenplay by Peter Filardi and a story by both of those. The film stars Robin Tunney. I'm going to say Fairuza Balk because I've been calling her Fairuza Balk for the past 20-something years. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. Neve Campbell and Rachel True. It follows 4 outcast teenage girls at Los Angeles parochial high school who pursue witchcraft for their own gain and subsequently experience negative repercussions. Now, Julia, you and I have both worked in schools, and Catholic schools are usually traditionally seen as being a lot more strict. Was it just me, or did the uniform policy in this school seem insane?
I mean, for me, it was a bit jarring to see a uniform in an American high school setting. Mm-hmm. Because normally they just apparently like wear normal clothes, which I've always found very weird. But yeah, there's a variety of different uniforms going on. Like
I'm just saying, like, whoever's job it is to enforce that, they are doing a really bad job. Do you know what I mean?
They just don't care. I mean, I would love to have been able to wear like little turtlenecks and polo shirts when I was at school. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like, I don't know if this is me showing my age or what, but I've got a bit of a thing for goth girls. Do you know what I mean? That whole aesthetic is like, I feel right at home with it. Do you know
Chef's
what?
Kiss.
I think it makes people look hotter. You know, I think that's the honest truth about it. You know,
slap a bit of eyeliner on, does wonders.
We're away at the races. So my first fact. 85 other actresses screen tested for the 4 main roles. Would you want to have a guess at some of them? Let's do a little bit of fantasy casting. Who would you have cast in this at this time?
Oh, okay. I mean, I feel like maybe if Sarah Michelle Gellar had been in there, then like that really could have
I'm so glad
things.
You said that, because as I was watching this, I kept thinking, I'm pretty confident this film could exist in the Buffyverse. I like the idea that Buffy is just like one town over, like fighting off vampires in her first school and setting fire and burning down the gym, you know? So Sarah Michelle Gellar would have been a good shout. Believe it or not, Angelina Jolie, Alicia Silverstone and Scarlett Johansson all auditioned for this role. Ooh. Now, here's the thing I can't quite figure out yet, is that Scarlett Johansson is born in 1984, meaning, and like November 1984, this film came out in May, so she would have been 11 at the time of the film's release. So how on earth do you even bother looking at casting somebody who is that young for the teenage role of Sarah. Do you know what I picture this? I picture like a tiny little Scarlett Johansson coming in, and she can just about see over the casting table. Just doesn't quite work.
Little pigtails. Yeah. That.
I'm going to be an Avenger.
Sure, Scarlett. Sure.
Fact number 2: Robin Tunney. Her hair looks pretty great in this, doesn't it? Robin Tunney wore an auburn wig throughout filming because she shaved her head for the role in Empire Records, which had just wrapped up filming a month before production started on this film. So if her hair at any point looks too perfect in this film, it's because it literally is.
That's a testament to the wig makers, to be honest, because I've seen some shocking wigs adorn both the big screen and the silver screen, because I would never have clocked that to be a wig.
Fact number 3: in 2017, Fleming stated that Charmed ripped off this film. Fleming revealed he wrote a pilot based on the movie for Fox, in which WB, that's the Warner Brothers network, was strongly interested, and that it was his idea to have "How Soon Is Now" as its title theme. That's the song that's originally done by the Smiths, and it gets you hear it at certain points in the soundtrack, and obviously that's the soundtrack to the theme tune to Charmed. The pilot was not picked up, and the following year, Charmed premiered. Furthermore, Robin Tunney stated the rip-off was completely obvious, to the point that people would think I was on Charmed for years later. So we've got a little bit of like Babylon 5, Deep Space Nine stuff going on there. Do you know what I mean?
Interesting, yeah. I've never actually watched Charmed myself, which feels a bit sacrilegious, considering that, Buffy is probably one of my favourite, if not my absolute favourite TV show of all time. I feel like they sort of come hand in hand.
The bits I've seen of it looked a bit green screeny, so I was like, I'll get round to it. Well, obviously,
the werewolf suits in Buffy. I'm just saying.
The werewolf suits in Buffy are there. The werewolf suits in Buffy are interesting, but there we go. Obviously, there's the sort of legacy sequel to The Craft Legacy, which came out in 2020. Are you familiar with that one?
I did watch it actually, maybe a year or two ago, so I have seen it. Okay. I really don't remember that much of it, so it clearly didn't have much of an impact on me.
So it was super memorable. The levitation effect was achieved by resting Rachel True on a platform held up by a pole in the floor. The pole was digitally removed in post-production. Like that technique, that just the way they shoot that whole scene is just kind of quite beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love the way they do that, because how can I put it? Not everything in this film has particularly held up. Do you know what I mean? Some of the effects are. Some of the effects feel like they wouldn't be out of place in an Aerosmith music video, And
yeah, no, I can see that.
But the levitation thing, I think, was absolutely on point. The shots of Nancy being covered in bugs were created by wrapping a life cast of Fairuza Balk's head and torso in green screen material. The bugs were filmed crawling all over the casting and then digitally composited on top of the live action plate of Balk. I think that's brilliant. Like
that, do you know what? I was appreciate watching you and wondering how they did that, because for me, any scene where I would have to have bugs on me like that. Mm-hmm. No, keep your paycheck. All
the snakes as well.
Yeah, the snakes maybe I don't mind so much. It's bugs. The idea of little bug feet.
I was just seeing the snakes bit and thinking Indiana Jones would be absolutely bricking it at this point.
Yeah,
absolute brown trouser time for that archaeologist.
Yeah, oh my god, he would not survive. I don't think that would just finish him off.
My final fact is that rumours persisted for years that Fairuza Balk was a practicing witch or Wiccan herself. And weirdly, she actually stated that on the DVD commentary incorrectly at some point. In 2017, she set the record straight. She wasn't a practicing witch. She'd merely bought an occult shop in the process of doing research for the film.
Sorry, she just bought an occult shop. She bought her a magic. That's dedication to the role.
Can you imagine? You walk out of the shop, you've bought some things, you look at the receipt and go,
I'm baffled. That's incredible. I just imagine someone walking into your shop being like, yeah, I really need to do some preparation for a role. Can I just buy your shop? Just the whole thing. Bricks and all. You can go home. You're done here. Like, incredible.
They do things very differently in LA. That's all I can say,
Very differently.
So there we go. Those are my facts.
Fabulous. So I guess now is time for finding the faith in the film.
Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-ba!
Yeah.
That's
like
awesome. That's the first time I've ever been able to say that.
I know, right? So, you're going to be listening to my dulcet tones now, even more so than you would usually.
100% down for it.
I am going to preface this with I have tried to cram as much in as possible while also being succinct. But this topic in general has a lot of roots and a lot of pathways and a lot of information there. So if you do hear anything that interests you, I would absolutely suggest going off and doing a little bit more digging, because this is only the very surface of this topic.
Sure.
So we're going to start off with asking, what does witchcraft mean? What is the definition of the word? And it's one that tends to defy narrow categorization, and it's one that's changed a lot over time. So 400 years ago, if you ask somebody what a witch is or what a witch means, this is a person, usually a woman, who wants to cause harm by magical means. They are someone who is categorically evil. But if you look at a modern definition of what a witch is anybody who believes in magic and uses magic to influence the world around them. So in order to kind of figure out how we've gone from one extreme to the other when we talk about witchcraft, we're going to have to delve into history, which is one of my favourite things to do.
If only I had some historians handy for this.
I know, right? If, call in from home if you want to be a little God in film. There could probably be historians about God in film in like 100 years. Wouldn't that be cool? Again, I digress. So from what we know, humans have actually been doing magic for a long time, we think. In England and a lot of places in Europe, it's not really until we move into the Middle Ages, so sort of your 1300s, that we begin seeing written evidence and more standardised ways of practising magic. And that is in the form of something called a grimoire. So in this context, a grimoire is often their blends of things like farming almanacs, beauty tips, but they also contain things like magic spells. And there are loads of them all across Europe. They are sort of like your penny dreadfuls of the time. They become really popular collector's pieces throughout the medieval periods, and it brings witchcraft to an educated audience. So what was often sort of like an oral tradition actually becomes compiled and written down. And some of these grimoires actually boast authors from the Bible, such as King Solomon. Yeah, so you have the Lesser Keys of Solomon is one that comes up quite a lot. So Keys of Solomon grimoires is like your bread and butter for, we need a ooky spooky book for our horror film. So I think it comes up in Hereditary, if that's a film that you've seen, but it's Keys of Solomon gets referenced quite a lot, but you also have the 6th and 7th books of Moses, which I will talk about later, which are purported to have been written by Moses. So already
that word
we
purported
can see,
is doing some heavy lifting there, isn't it?
It is. Keep that in the back of your...
Am I skipping ahead?
Spoilers. We will talk a little bit about the books of Moses a bit later, but yeah, purported is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting in this situation. But these grimoires, they compile rituals and spells that were commonplace among the layfolk, but they also have these very complicated ceremonies, which usually do things like summon angels and demons to kind of do the caster's bidding. So if you think John Dee, who was the sort of court magician for Elizabeth I, he's doing a lot of this summoning kind of Enochian entities and all this kind of stuff.
That dude was a creepy dude, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I only know a very little amount about him, and he was basically sort of like a sanctioned witch, because this is still during the witch hunt period, which is something that I will briefly talk about, but very briefly. But yeah, he did a lot of scrying, which is the idea of kind of looking usually in bodies of water or in very dark obsidian mirrors, sort of trying to see the future. It's sort of like a divination kind of technique.
Looking for some kind of angel that's going to come and talk to him, is that right?
A lot of his stuff I think was angel based, but more than that I actually haven't looked at. But he's definitely one to have a look at if you're interested in this period and this sort of angelic magic almost, because there's a big trend of summoning archangels and angels to sort of do things for you, and using angelic seals and this kind of thing is very much sort of in vogue at the time.
Okay. I found out his name D. He's of Welsh descent.
Oh, interesting.
So the name D comes from the Welsh word D, which is like, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is like the Welsh word for black.
Oh, that's cool. So this is great. You've taught me something now. I think we always come back to Wales. Wales tends to pop up quite a lot in these episodes now, and that just clearly shows that Wales is just awesome.
Absolutely.
But obviously, once we move out of the early sort of Middle Ages and we get into the early modern period, I would be remiss, of course, if I don't mention that this is peak witch hunting period. So this starts in about 1550 and ends in around 1660, but that's not super specific. I could do a whole podcast on the witch hunts alone. There is so much to delve into there, so I'm just going to breeze over it for now, but I do so reluctantly because it's such an interesting period.
Have you ever heard about Giles Corey?
No, Giles Corey is not a name I'm familiar with.
So Giles Corey was a farmer accused with witchcraft during the Salem witch trials, and he refused to enter a guilty or not guilty plea. So what they did was, they called it pressing, where they would kind of crush you to death by putting more and more weights on top of you. And what Giles Corey says, when they put so many flipping weights on him, he says, more weight. He's like, pack these stones on me. I'm not going to do what he say. Like,
hell yeah.
Like, Giles are awesome. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, Giles is awesome.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen or met or heard about a Giles that was bad.
There's one or two bad Gileses out there, but I am in the process of hunting them down.
Oh, good. Yeah. How many have you got left? That one.
2 or 3, I think. You know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you can definitely get to those in time. But yeah, much like historical Giles are being persecuted during this period, so magic is now very heavily frowned upon. People are actively persecuted, or they have to go underground or stop practicing altogether. And then you combine this with moving into what we call the Age of Reason, which is your 1600s and your 1700s, where you've got pioneers like Isaac Newton, who are sort of going, oh, all this kind of hogwash spiritualism, you know, you need science and logic and facts, and that's all nonsense. And magic more or less disappears.
Is this where the Enlightenment kicks in?
Yeah, so it's
like the scientific method and all that sort of stuff.
So this obsession with sort of science and grounded fact, and kind of moving away from sort of this hogwash of the masses. And so magic is pretty much pushed out of public interest for quite a long time. And it's not until you get to the Victorian period where you get the sort of arrival of mysticism and figures like Alastair Crowley, who is a very influential occultist, kind of an arsehole.
Crowley's like 20th century, isn't he?
Yeah, so he's operating in the late 1800s, so he is kind of around, but most of his stuff is, so I use Victorian period perhaps a little bit loosely here, but he is founding his own orders in sort of 1904 and 1914-ish respectively, but he's got fingers in pies kind of all across his period, just kind of dabbling and just generally not. He's quite a controversial figure. He's very influential, but also like at what cost? Do you know what I mean? He just wasn't.
How do you mean?
A lot of his I'm just trying to think how to put this now. He's a controversial figure in that a lot of his work was quite could be quite sensational. So
I mean, he looks scary as hell.
Yeah, I also get the vibe
he looks
from
like
him
an
from what I've
angry
sort of read
potato.
Yeah, I get the vibe from him that he's sort of that, you know, that guy that like you meet at uni who's like doing philosophy and like he's just kind of a dick about it. He's that guy. Do you know what I mean? So he comes up with this religion called Thelema and writes a whole book about it, where he and his wife at the time were just having a sleepover at the pyramids of Giza, which you could do back then. And
Awesome.
she begins to channel the god Horus, and so he writes all of this down into 3 books, which then becomes the Book of the Law. But I digress once again. But basically, during this time, you get these big secret society ceremonial type groups. So think the first Sherlock Holmes film with Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah.
Very much that. So you have the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is a really famous one, and you also have the Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO, which Alastair Crowley kind of rebrands in the early 1900s. And OTO actually exists today still.
I mean, if you've got a famous secret society, it sounds like it's fallen down on its first objective. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I say secret kind of more in vibe than in actuality. Some of them were essentially just gentlemen's clubs with like extra steps. But I mean, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn actually enlisted women, unlike societies such as the Freemasons, which is, yes, the Freemasons that you're thinking of, minus all the conspiracy Nicolas Cage theories about that, because Freemasons it's boys only. All right, it also enlisted working class men at the time, which was considered quite liberal, but it was still, you know, boys only. So a lot of these sort of they're just gentlemen's clubs, but also sometimes we put on funny robes and do some chants every now and then, you know. But these groups have these very rigid hierarchical systems that rely on like initiation to sort of advance through the ranks. So you'll have a mentor who'll teach you about certain areas of the mystic arts, and then once you've passed that test, you can kind of continue to the next stage. There is something a little bit pyramid schemey about them.
Right, okay.
Not my favourite, but these groups tend to practice a branch of magic which is based on something called Hermeticism, which is a blend of ancient Greek and Egyptian philosophy, from which we get the famous mantra, as above, so below, which you do hear in the craft at least once, if not a few more times. But it's from this philosophy that Wicca kind of emerges from. So these groups were a big inspiration in creating Wicca. So that was a very whistle-stop tour through some of the high and the low points in the history of witchcraft. But now onto the juicy stuff, which is asking, what is Wicca? So Wicca, sometimes known as the craft, as we've seen, is an earth-centered pagan religion. Its members follow a ethical code called the Wiccan Rede, the core moral of that code being, an it harm none, do as ye will. That's like, the Rede itself is quite a long poem, but those 2 lines are sort of the takeaway of the whole thing, basically. As long as you don't do any harm, do what you like. Its core deities are a divine masculine and a divine feminine entity, the god, or the horned god, and the goddess, which is also a triple goddess, so it has 3 aspects to it. You've got your maiden, which is sort of like the young version, you've got your mother, and you've got your crone, which is the older version.
Yeah. We start, like, often the witches in Macbeth get sort of shown in that sort of format,
they do.
Don't they?
Yeah, quite often. Having 3 of them, I think, really kind of lends into that. But Hecate, who also appears in Macbeth, but she is a Greek goddess, is often conflated as a triple goddess as well. So you'll get a few other non-Wiccan pagan religions that will kind of borrow off of this idea. The celebrations of the Wiccan religion are collectively called the Wheel of the Year, and they're tied to things like solar and seasonal cycles, and they also partly chronicle the lifestyle of the goddess. So you have sort of your spring celebrations that are associated with the maiden, and then the summer stuff is sort of mother, and then by the time that you get to winter, the goddess has sort of become a crone and is ready to begin that cycle again. So it's one that's very sort of bound to nature and the seasons and observing the cycles of the earth. It's founded by a guy called Gerald Gardner. So you might have heard of him. He's quite a big deal in the obviously because he founded Wicca, but he's up there with other figures such as Scott Cunningham and Doreen Valiente, who are also writing a lot about witchcraft and Wicca at this time. So in 1936, Gardner was initiated into a coven of witches in the New Forest near where he lived, and he believed this group of witches to be a direct descendant of an ancient witch cult. We'll talk about that in a minute. I can see you looking a little bit.
You can see my face. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll talk about that in a second. And eventually, he publishes his findings in a book called Witchcraft Today in 1954, and that's kind of when it sort of becomes a more formalised. Here is Wicca. I done make. Now this witch cult thing, I will explain. So, Gardner was very much inspired by the writings of an Egyptologist called Margaret Murray. Good old Margaret. So in 1921...
She has she's a historian, but with like a laissez-faire approach to the truth and facts. Am I thinking of the right person?
Yeah. So to be
fair,
it's a
good, great ripping yarn. But
yeah, it's a lovely story. I think I have moaned about her actually when I was previously waxing lyrical in an unreleased deleted scene of God in Film. But she publishes a book in 1921 called The Witch Cult in Western Europe, in which she purports that witchcraft, as we know it now, is actually a continuation of this ancient pan-European pagan goddess cult, which the church tried its very last attempt to stamp out with the witch hunts, and they haven't worked. And it's unfortunately just categorically not true. She bent a lot of evidence to sort of fit her claims. She didn't really take into account that a lot of the victims of the witch hunts were Christian and would have considered themselves Christian at the time. Yeah. There's just no evidence to support this, but sadly it's one of those, much like the corsets will ruin your ribs myth, it's one that's just kind of permeated into quite a lot of the culture at the moment, and it's just not true, which is a shame, because I think for some they sort of perpetuate with, if it's not old, it's not as good. You look at other standardised religions which have detailed history going back thousands of years, and Wicca is 60, 70 years old. So I think there's a pressure there for them to be taken seriously, that they need to have these ancient roots. And in my humble opinion, I don't think that's necessarily the case. But so Gardner was also interested and very influenced by Alastair Crowley, the ceremonial magic that you get in OTO, and he incorporates a lot of these elements into Wiccan rituals. So you kind of see this in the craft. A lot of the witchcraft that they do in the craft is pretty accurate. Usually you'll start with cleansing everything. So you'll see they do this sometimes with like sage bundles and things. So you kind of clean out your space spiritually, and then you'll cast a circle, and often that's represented in the film. They have like candles usually, or just lines, but it can also be sort of a spiritual mental circle. And then once you've got that circle, you call in your corners, so your north, south, east, west, your earth, your air, your fire, your water, you do all of that. And then you raise energy within that circle, so that can be with chanting, singing, drumming, dancing, and then once you've got all that energy in the circle, you can carry out any spell work if spell work is what you're there to do. And then after that, you dismiss your corners, you reopen your circle, and usually, I think as with most religious orders, you have a good old slap up meal, some wine, some cakes, and you're done.
You know what those like theists are like? They will always, the cakes are the spread is always pretty good, you know. Doesn't
matter what you worship, the spread of any big religion, always incredible, always good.
Yeah. This is why I think atheism is just not really taking off, is I just don't think the food is as good.
I'm not going to lie, man. Yeah, like I've been to a lot of atheistic gatherings, and the food, not that great, right? Atheists, come on, guys.
It's fine, you know.
We need to up our game, okay. We need to be better. But it's easy to see, having gone through all of this, you know, big rituals and all these spell works, that it's easy to see that Wicca and witch are often used synonymously. But arguably, while all Wiccans are witches, not all witches are Wiccan.
Hang on. Tell me that again, so I can. Which ones are the thumbs in this equation?
So you could argue, I'll put arguably, all Wiccans are witches, but not all witches are Wiccans.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
So
the witches is the bigger
yes, the witches
umbrella term.
are the umbrella.
Wiccan, the more small specific
Absolutely,
thing.
yeah. So witchcraft, you'll get a lot in modern times. I find you get a lot of like Norse pagan witches, Greek pagan witches, that kind of thing. Usually, any kind of pagan pantheon, you'll find there are a lot of witches that kind of flock to that. Wicca eventually has to go way underground when we get to the 70s and the 80s, and even into the 90s due to a lovely phenomena called the Satanic Panic, which again I could do a whole podcast on. Really interesting.
Satanic Panic, yeah, we covered that fairly comprehensively. Yeah. If you want to check that out, that's in our Omen episode, I think. Really
interesting. As a D&D player as well, very interesting. So it has to go way underground for quite good reason, because, you know, it could get pretty hairy out there for those kinds of people. What this does mean, though, is that writing and information about Wicca and witchcraft was thin on the ground and not really readily available. And the stuff that you could get very much was like, this is a secret, ancient society thing, and we don't really talk to other people about it, and we don't really communicate about it. But after a partial rebrand, Wicca resurfaces again, so pentagrams and pentacles being a big thing that they sort of dial back on because of its association with Satanists and the Church of Satan.
And the Church of Satan they're an explicitly atheist group, aren't they?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about Satanism, to be honest.
So the Church of Satan, they are, how can I put it? If being an edgelord was a religion,
yeah, that's the vibe that I always got.
That would be these guys. So they've literally said that they are atheists, and that they think of themselves as like a free speech organization.
Yeah. Like
if you can have, they'll set up these, how can I put it? Nuisance kind of cases, like you've got the Ten Commandments written out in front of your court building. Why can't we have a statue of Satan in front of the court building as well?
Yeah.
And it's just like, is this really how you want to spend your time, lads? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it seems a bit like it's purposefully mean-spirited to me. Like, I understand that for some people there is a lot of trauma concerned with how a church has treated them, but it seems to me that it's largely, the idea of it is just to kind of get back at silly Christians who want to oppress people, and it's like you can do that in other ways, and in sort of in more constructive and meaningful ways. Yeah, but yeah, it seems for an atheistic society, but you've based yourself on Abrahamic. But it just seems a bit weird. But you'll know a Satanist pentagram because at the top you'll have 2 points, and at the bottom you'll have 1 point, because the 2 points kind of, if you think of how the pentagram looks, the 2 points at the top are like the little goat ears, and then the bottom point will be like his chin. But if a pagan, a Wiccan pentagram will just have 1 point at the top, and that's kind of how I tell the difference. So pentagrams, pentacles, they kind of get rebranded a little bit. They sort of go, yeah, look, we're not Satanists, we don't worship the devil, you know, we just want to drink wine and have cakes and make circles, and, you know, we're just doing our thing. So we see the representation of Wicca, especially in things such as Buffy, Charmed. This is very love and light kind of practice, but also when you look at things like the craft, it kind of implies that this is something that, you know, can corrupt you if you sort of take it too far. But as of 2021, there are an estimated 13,858 people in the UK who self-identify as witches. So
that is not a lot, really, is it? It's very small.
Not much. I think there's still a little bit of, I don't know, maybe stigma is the wrong word, but there's still a lot of misconception, I think. So that's Wicca. But the question that we've come here to answer today is, can you be a witch and also be a Christian at the same time?
No.
To play.
Thanks for joining us, guys. Have a lovely evening.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, listen, I'm going to disagree with you, but I definitely want to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, I'm hoping that maybe I can not convince you per se, but I can sort of, it might be a, no, right, do you know what I mean?
Okay.
Because
All
off
right,
the
go
bat,
for
I
it.
think we knew this would be a bit of a controversial topic, considering there is big, there's a big historical beef between witches and the church, which is
Yeah.
still pretty prevalent today. The Bible has a couple things to say about witchcraft. None of it, from what I seems, is very good. You've got
not loving it.
Deuteronomy 18:9-12 is, "Let none be found amongst you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritualist who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord." And obviously our lovely Exodus 18:12, which is, "Suffer not a witch to live." They don't really like witches in the Bible.
No.
That's understandable to a degree, especially during the early modern period, as we've discussed. A witch is someone who does things specifically for evil purposes. They subvert the societal norm. So especially
Yeah, so the analogue that I use to describe it to people in classes, like in the Jacobean era, witches are to them what like terrorists were in a post 9/11 world, you know?
Exactly. These are people who, are gonna, a big thing that they were really afraid of is like stealing fertility. So that could be in either men or women, that this witch could kind of steal your ability to have children, was a really big fear. But they basically subvert, they poison communities and they do things solely for evil. So it's very easy to see why, you think the word witch, and for a lot of Christians even now, that's kind of what you think of. But during the witchcraft period, the line between witchcraft and Christianity was actually quite blurred. So during this period, you, especially in rural areas, you have like a local cunning person or a wise woman who is basically sort of like your doctor, your midwife, your vet, your sorcerer, kind of all mixed together in one. And they provide cures to local men and women. They're also sort of providing livestock advice, and they're doing this in a way that we would probably consider witchcraft. So you're mixing together potions, things like witch bottles, which are protective charms for your house. So you would put things in there like nails and hair clippings and pee. Sometimes they're not very nice, but this was the idea that you had one of these in your house, and that meant that witches could not infiltrate your space, right? But they do this by incorporating prayers and psalms. And so a really popular spell for a house blessing was to have a cunning person come along, and they would write, "Let every spirit praise the Lord. They have Moses and the prophets. Let God arise and his enemies be scattered," which I think is a mix of psalms in Latin on the building wall. So you're looking at Christian mysticism, I guess, Christian magic being used outside of a church context quite often. I do also want to say, when we're in the witchcraft period, you couldn't point your finger at Becky over the road and be like, "She's a witch," and they'd drag her off and burn her. There would have to be, there was a massive legal process. You'd have to have evidence, you'd have to have witnesses. In some places, it could get pretty hysteric, but not all the time in all places. It's one of those where there's not a single blanket rule that applies all across the period. So often the people that are being accused are people that are using Christian magic, just not in a way that the church or that people in power liked. So it's sort of like, a lot of these analogies that I'll talk about go more from a Catholic perspective. This is sort of during the Reformation, but you've still got a lot of communities that are Catholic. So things like blessing candles and blessing holy water in a church context is fine. But the little old lady, blessing amulets in her cottage down the road, sometimes less fine.
I just want to jump in here for a sec. So if I'm thinking this through, the King James Bible doesn't get sort of printed until 1611, and then the first Bible that's actually in English is, of all places, in Antwerp in 1535. So before we get like proper Reformation stuff, you literally don't know what the priests are saying in the sermons and that, because it's in Latin. So you're told about Jesus and God and the rest of it, but you don't have any means by which to check this stuff out for yourself. And the and there's no scientific method to speak of. There's no like specializing in different things. So in this sense, in this context, could you be a witch and a Christian at the same time? I can totally understand it, and I can accept it in that context because, put bluntly, people didn't know any better. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like it was a very difficult period in general. I mean, because you've got people educating themselves and sort of taking power into their own hands, which means that you're losing quite a lot of control. But then again, this theory doesn't work for all places where people are affected by witch hunts, right? Which is what makes this period so interesting. But for where we're talking about, you've got people who are beginning to think for themselves. You've got a very different view of how the devil works, because in this period, witches are exclusively in league with the devil. It's how they get their power, basically. They might think that they're doing something from God, but they've got their power from the devil, and that is that. So it's a very tumultuous time, right? But I'm gonna maybe put forward some modern examples, or modern-ish examples, of how sort of Christianity and witchiness can maybe overlap. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, do you remember I was talking about the OTO and the Order of the Golden Dawn and those kind of societies? So in that kind of philosophy, that Hermeticism, in Hermeticism, you have something called the Kabbalah. Now that's Kabbalah with a Q. This is going to get real interesting, folks. So Hermetic Kabbalah.
When does Britney Spears come into it?
Later, Giles, definitely later. Just wait, just wait. Let me get through this, and then I promise there's Britney at the end, just for you. But you've got Hermetic Kabbalah with a Q, right? And Kabbalah with a Q is appropriated from Spanish Jews in the sort of 15th century, and Jewish Kabbalah is with a K.
Right.
So the Jewish Kabbalah with a K is first kind of appropriated by Christians in the 15th century, and you get Kabbalah with a C. So there's three kinds of Kabbalah. You've got Q Kabbalah, K Kabbalah, and C Kabbalah.
And then Che Guevara.
And Che Guevara. So there's lots of Kabbalahs floating around. But basically, the Kabbalah is a tree of life system. So it's supposed to represent the tree of life that grows in Eden, and it's made up of 10 spheres or sephiroths, which Sephiroth is like, I think it's a Final Fantasy character, so I guess this is where that comes from. And each Sephiroth basically symbolizes aspects of God's creative power. So the Christian Kabbalah ascribes these spheres and the pathways that connect them as being different elements of Jesus and Jesus's life and divine mission. And so the idea is that you use this Kabbalah as a meditational tool. So you take one Sephiroth, you really think about that, you meditate that, you study Bible passages that kind of go along with that, and you use that to foster a closer connection to God and to Jesus Christ. In Kabbalah with a Q, in Hermetic Kabbalah, they begin to link this with things like zodiac, with Hebrew, symbols, with elements, and again, they're using this to try and achieve a closer relationship with a higher being, which I think is very interesting. You look skeptical, which is good.
Yeah, just a smidge. Carry on. Let's see where this goes.
I mean, it's basically appropriated from Jewish culture, but it's one of those where it was appropriated such a long time ago that these things have kind of had more time to sort of become their own different things. But that one I find a little bit thorny, because it was basically just stolen again from the Jewish community, which is not good. We don't like cultural appropriation, guys. It's really not good. For me, though, folk magic really, I think, encapsulates the witchy energy and the Christian synergy, right? So I've briefly talked about this. Folk magic is probably what we would describe the witch hunt period witches using. It's very much a more down-to-earth, practical kind of magic. So things like Cornish witches, for example, would do a thing where they would sell wind to sailors. So they would cast spells to tie the wind in knots in a string, and then you sell that, and then when you untie a knot, you can release winds. So these are things that help you in kind of daily life. They're sort of spontaneous, down to earth, quick and dirty kind of magic that you just sort of do all the time. You know, you don't have to get your fancy robes on and cast your circle and do all that stuff. It's your classic, when you think witchcraft, folk magic is very probably what you're thinking of.
That's interesting.
And Italian folk magic, I found a really good description of this from a guy called John di Calandra, and he describes it as a seamless blending of witchcraft and ecclesiastical teaching, their deep devotion to the cult of the saints and the Virgin Mary. So for Italian folk practitioners, most Italian folk practitioners are so heavily Catholic that to suggest that they were witches would be quite offensive to them. But it's one where it's so ingrained in the other that it can be quite hard to separate them. But a lot of Italian folk practitioners, especially going back sort of 20, 30 years, would never describe themselves as witches. For Italian folk practice, saints play a really, really important role in daily practice. So it's not uncommon to have lots of different altars, so an altar is like a sacred space. They're actually in the craft, when they first go into the sort of the magic shop, there's a close up of like a shrine, which has clearly got Mary de Guadalupe, the sort of the Mexican. She's quite prevalent in Mexico, but it's a version of the Virgin Mary as a shrine there, which I thought was really interesting. Whether they did that on purpose or whether that was just kind of already there that they kind of incorporated, I'm not sure. But saints are really, really important. So you'll usually have a sacred space or a devotional statue or something to a bunch of different saints all around your house. And they're there to be called upon to assist you when you need something. So, for example, if you've lost something, you might invoke Saint Anthony with the charm, Tony, Tony, come around, something's lost and can't be found, which I thought was really cute. But even things like, hanging, I'm not sure who the patron saint would be, but hanging the patron saint of travel, for example, a little icon of them above in your car, having, a patron saint to sort of hearth and cooking and stuff, you might find one of those in your kitchen. Quite often you'll get Joseph, as in Jesus' dad, Joseph, the big Joe. Big Joe. Sets the word shines to him. If you've had a particularly good year, you'll kind of give extra offerings and things to him to sort of thank him for that. And we also see there's a significant overlap in sacred tools and witchcraft and Catholic sacramental tools. So altars, of course, being one, but things like ash, bells, blessed objects, candles, crosses, incense, rosaries, the paraphernalia kind of associated with both of them. There's a big overlap there. Which I think mostly, if you're Catholic, I think you could probably settle into becoming a witch quite easily. I feel like there's a lot of overlap. I think maybe if you're not Catholic, you might have a bit of a harder time.
Well, I think the Catholicism first of all, doesn't it essentially, Catholicism means universal, doesn't it? The idea when that forms as a denomination is that it's meant to kind of take in all the other weird little proto-denominations of Christianity under its wing. Then you get the kind of schism around 1000 AD with the Greek Orthodox. But I've always thought of it a bit like, how can I put it? Catholicism's a bit like a snowball rolling downhill, and it just picks up stuff as it goes along until it gets bigger and sample, bigger. Yeah. And bigger. And before you know it, we've got all the things that are how can I put it? Catholic headcanon kind of get stuck in there, like lords and saints, and we've got to have a pope and he's got to be elected this way, and there's a Swiss guard, and there's, how can I put it? And I want to be as respectful as possible. There's so much nonsense attached to Catholicism that it doesn't surprise me that this stuff might get attracted to it in some areas as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's one where, because I think a lot more in terms of how a worship is carried out, in the same way that witchcraft is very it's about intent and using things that correspond to what you're trying to do. So the scene where Sarah first tries to bind Nancy with the ribbon, I've seen that spell in so many spell books, usually with black ribbon, but any kind of ribbon, the act of physically sort of tying up that picture, the idea is that you're kind of putting your intent and using kind of sympathetic objects to further that intention, right? But the other kind of folk magic I'm going to briefly talk about is Black American folk magic, also called voodoo and or hoodoo. I think there is a difference. I've, again, only really scratched the surface of this one, so I couldn't say either way, which is why I've included them both. But it's a blend of Christian and spiritual elements practiced historically by enslaved people, and is still common now in places like New Orleans, for example, where you had a really big influx of enslaved people, usually sort of trying to kind of assimilate into the world that they've kind of been thrust into, but also kind of keeping elements of their own culture alive. There's a common saying, for example, that Haiti is 70% Catholic, 30% Protestant, and 100% voodoo. And this is where I'm going to talk about the books of Moses, which I promised I would touch upon later. But the 6th and 7th books of Moses are really influential for this kind of folk magic. And I say purported to be written by Moses. It first appears in Germany in like the 19th century. And we don't really have any idea of where it came from before that. But basically it contains, they're purported to be hidden or lost books of the Bible that are now kind of coming forth. And they contain seals and incantations which can be used to potentially recreate miracles.
You know what? This is so weird, right? Because normally 99% of this show, I'm the credulous one. I'm the one saying, and this is what I believe, and I hope that's okay. And my atheist friends have to go, huh? Yeah, sure, okay, well, you do that, Charles. And now I'm here going, that's interesting.
But
you know?
Yeah, I mean, speaking as someone who is neither Christian nor a practitioner of any of these kinds of magic, I'm kind of looking at it from like a nice kind of... I'm trying to explain,
you've got a bit of
as an
distance on
atheist
all things
to a Christian why maybe you could be a Christian and a witch when I'm not even Christian to begin with. But these books, they also contain things like spells for good health and other such things. But the idea being that these books obviously are purported to have biblical authors, and in some cases Moses is also he's sort of re-skinned as this semi sort of sorcerer kind of figure rather than the miracle worker. But basically, from what I've sort of spewed at you, the sort of denomination being that basically, rather than it being, the horned god or I don't know, or Circe or some other kind of, god that's channeling, that you're able to theoretically channel these spells through, you're using God or a saint or an archangel to work this magic, basically. And that is sort of where the overlap theoretically begins. But that's the end of my spiel. That's all I've got to spiel.
You know what?
So
I found that really...
I'll leave you with that to ruminate.
Thank you so much for telling us about that. Like, I think, so from my perspective, talking about the thing about like witches getting their power from the devil and all the rest of it, there's the aspect where where something can be false in the micro but true in the macro.
Yeah.
So for example, the witch, we talk about like witches or Wicca, like serving the earth and all this sort of stuff, and they obviously rejecting the idea of like serving Satan and all the rest of it, and in nailing it down to the specifics, that's true, as demonstrably true as that can be. But if you've got a God who is saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He's like saying, guys, I'm really sorry, but this is all you got. Then anything that serves as a distraction to that then becomes an opposition to that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I can understand that.
So by by suggesting that there is something else or another valid option out there, then it's... I'm trying to think of the way I want to phrase it. Then if you did believe in the devil, and if the devil was true, if the devil was a real person, I'm trying to put my atheist hat on, then the devil would want you to do all these different things. But then again, the devil would want you to be focused on literally anything but God and Jesus and all the rest of it, you know? So when we say, like, when we might sort of talk about, like, witches serving the devil, it's like, yeah, but I think if you wanted to, you could apply that to lots of people, you know, in lots of different contexts. I think it sort of depends on what the devil means to you as well, because I want to get this in. But during the witch hunt period, another sort of cog in the big machine is this idea of how the devil becomes, in Catholicism, when it's sort of earlier, the devil was like a real, especially medieval Catholicism, the devil was a real dude. You could be walking down the road at night and the devil could be like, hey, what's up? You know, do you want to, I don't know, I challenge you to a dance off, right? He could absolutely do that. He's a physical element, but a physical element you can outwit. A physical person you can say, no, I'm not interacting with you, Satan. Get thee behind me, right? And as we move into the early modern period, into the Reformation period, the devil becomes less of a physical person that you could meet, and the devil was more of a sort of ethereal concept. You think bad thoughts, the devil can get you. You know, it becomes have bad feelings. Abstract concept.
Yeah, he becomes a lot more abstract. It becomes a lot more psychological, and so you can't.
And do you know what? It's interesting is
tell
that
a psychological being to get on his bike. Do you know what I mean?
He does get mentioned in the Bible, obviously, and he does get referenced a fair bit, but he's not that much of a player in the sense that Jesus is more interested in you and what you do and the actions that the sins that you do, rather than saying, oh, the devil made me do it, you know?
Yeah.
He's because if like the devil, he might be bigger than us, but he's small compared to the Son of God, you know? He's like, Jesus does, like, how can I put it? Jesus, if the devil slagged off Jesus, Jesus would not even write the diss track. It just wouldn't be worth his time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I feel like the devil is like the trio, and like Buffy is like Jesus. Like they're trying. They're a nuisance. Like he's a nuisance. Sometimes he'll cause trouble, and sometimes he will do the occasional thing that's like, oh crap, that really sucks. But at the end of the day, Jesus can just smack him back into wherever, little pit. I read a folk story the other day about 2 hedgehogs that outwitted the devil. Like, it's not hard. So
that is perfect. That is the best metaphor I've seen in a long time. I think my problem, again, from what I've heard of modern Wiccans, I can tell that at least the ones I've heard of, are honest, sincere people who have good intentions, but the frustrations I had was that it felt like they were trying to claim a wider lineage than they actually had. Yeah. Like the fact that we can trace this back to Gerald Gardner in the 1930s is like, you're not a pre-Christian religion. You're something that some dude came up with who said he was hanging out with witches. Yeah.
And it's like, I've no doubt that, that there was some kind of, pagan religion that was going on, right? As an archaeologist, the amount of stuff that's like, we don't know what it is. It's ritual. Just what Wiccans practice now is not that. And we can't say that it was.
Pagan literally means, like, not Christian,
non-Christian,
So it's such a blanket term,
But I think there's such a pressure there that they feel that they need to, we're not relevant, we're not as good as a religion unless we're old like the other religions, and I don't think that's necessarily true.
Do you remember there's like an Eddie Izzard sketch about no flag, no country, those are the rules, Part of me wants to be like, I'm sorry, do you have a holy book? okay, well, not a proper religion then. Come back later when you've got one. You know, that's how I feel sometimes.
Yeah, I think
because you can't. It's really hard to have an argument or any kind of theological debate with somebody when their views are defined. You know, when their views aren't codified. Like, I find things like creeds quite creepy. You know, chanting. You know, and we believe this, that, and the other. But like my boss points out to me, it's like, yeah, the reason we had the things like the Nicene Creed or anything like that was so literally we could just get everybody all on the same page. You know, it's like we believe this, we believe this, we believe this, and this, like, these are the bare minimums. Do you know what I mean? If you wanna sort of think this or think that on that end, then okay, fine, we can have a discussion about that. But these are our main things. And with like Wiccans or just witchcraft, I can't find that.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting.
A big pull is that it's not organised, right? So I find a lot of people who go there are people who have come from very structural, organised religions. And it's like, mum and dad aren't here. We can do what we want, right? And especially, as I mentioned during the Satanic Panic, you know, you've got a lot of people who are going, well, this is just what I do in my backyard. You know, like, so unfortunately the Satanic Panic really set, I think, the culture back, because it meant that people could just write whatever they wanted and pass it off as, this is how we do things. And it's just, there's a lot more sifting, I think, that you have to do when you read witchcraft and Wicca books to kind of get to the heart of stuff that is genuinely rooted in some kind of tradition. And even if that's only a 100-year tradition or a 200-year tradition, you know, it's still somewhat rooted. But a lot of it is just like, some dude told me that rose petals will give me a boyfriend, so I did that. Do you know what I mean? It's
I think the appeal of it seems to be that it doesn't ask anything of you, not really. You know, and like, yeah, that's fine. And you know, we talk about like the Wiccan rule about anything you do will come back to you 3 times 3 or whatever. That's basically the golden rule. You kind of get that in every religion, don't you?
Yeah, and do you know what? That's really interesting, because that's not a hard and fast Wicca rule either.
Is it not?
No, not really. It's just
because
really
the girls in the craft don't actually know about it, and I'm like, guys, how do you not know this? This is like day one.
The threefold rule
you know?
is like the one thing that everyone knows, right? But it's not. It was sort of like a later edition. I'm not sure when it appears, but there's also a bit of discourse in the community where it's like, actually, the threefold rule is nonsense, and if you don't believe in it, then it, you know, like, it doesn't apply to you. A lot of it is sort of picking and choosing parts of the religion that you want to adhere to. That's the thing that
drives me insane. Like, which it's all, and I say this with most heartfelt respect, it's all a bit nonsense. Do you know what I mean?
There's this idea that your first tarot deck must be a gift. It has to be gifted to you. And then some people are like, no, that you can buy your own tarot deck, that's fine. Some people are like, well, actually, you have to steal your first tarot deck. So it's like, well, what's the actual tradition? So, and again, I think the Satanic Panic really helped with this, where people kind of go, you know, this is the rule that works for me. This is the correspondence of a flower that works for me. And then it kind of became Chinese whispered into being, oh, well, this is how everyone does it, when it might not necessarily be the case.
It literally is your own personal religion, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's the double-edged sword, really, is that that's what is really great about it, and also sort of its downfall in a way.
And that'll be what prevents it from ever growing, because you can't. It is like herding cats, basically. Seems to be the approach. Do you know what? Yeah. The one thing I really enjoyed though is when we were watching the craft, and they have the big scene about where they all sort of like make their spells, calling for something, and then Nancy asks for Manon to come into her and fill her, and then the next thing you see, the next day, you see her walking on water. And I'm like, my man JC did that first. Thank you very much. So I get this really tribalistic thing of like, if you guys want to pretend you're even close to being something worth talking about, you have to imitate my man JC, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
It's
you
interesting
flipping
that they did
pretend
that,
this to the throne.
Because Manon is a fictional. He was made
Yeah,
just for the craft.
completely fictional.
Just because I think they were wary of perpetuating anything that could maybe be harmful to the real life Wiccan community. But yeah, really interesting. But then the whole rule, it comes back 2 times 3. I'm going to say something that's maybe controversial. Laura Lizzie fully deserved to have all her hair fall out.
Yeah, that's not controversial.
Not
We were having this
controversial.
conversation, me and Claire, like, if you say racist things, your hair would fall out, and then you'd be like, there's a baldy, they must be racist. But then that backfired because I thought, well, hang on, if that was the case, then people would think that Patrick Stewart was racist, and I can't live in a world where anybody thinks bad things about Patrick Stewart. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. So I was a bit like, when obviously the badness times 3 comes back to Rochelle, right? But it's like, no, Laura Lizzie even fully deserved to have every single strand of hair fall out of her head for being racist.
Yeah, racist had it good. And do you know what's interesting? Originally, that character of Rochelle was meant to have like an eating disorder, and that was going to be her particular thing. But when Rachel True was cast in it, because she's African American, they changed it to the sort of racist subplot, and she said, I think it worked much better. It was much more interesting as a result, you know?
Yeah. No, I think I would agree with that, definitely.
Anyway, that is all we've got time for today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Wherever you are, please give Julia a round of applause, because she did an absolutely fantastic job of hosting God in Film. I am so proud of you. You've done amazingly. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I didn't think of it like that. I guess I have hosted now rather than guest
You're the
hosted.
only other person who's hosted God in Film. Everybody else has just co-hosted. So well done. Good job for you. Fantastic. All right, ladies and gents, if you have been listening, thank you so much. I don't know when we'll see you again, but I hope it'll be sometime soon. In the meantime, Julia, have you had a good time?
I've had a great time. This is my little special interest info dump. You've been my captive audience for an hour. I've had an excellent time. 10 out of 10.
Fantastic. I have had a very conflicting but also delightfully wonderful time. All right, ladies and gents, thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.
God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff.
That's me.
Mixing and editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
Please rate and review.
Please give us 5 stars because that's a nice thing to do.